Hello, and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. I had to take a break for a few weeks to deal with a medical emergency, but everything's fine. I'm doing fine. I hope you're doing fine. One person who I know is definitely doing fine at this point is Emanuel Lasker. He survived yet another very difficult game with the black pieces. I'll leave a card to it over there somewhere. Now he gets another shot with the white pieces where he's done very well this match. He scored 2 wins, and even his 1 draw very likely should have been a win. So odds are very good for him going into this game. Let's see what actually happened. For this game, the players repeat the opening they played in game number 3. So Lasker opened with d4, Mieses responded d5, c4, Mieses accepted the queen's gambit, knight to f3, and c5, opting for the Günzburg defense. Lasker repeated his move of d5, and now in game number 3, Mieses uncorked a since unrepeated novelty of knight to d7, where after e4 he defended the c4 pawn through knight to b6. Lasker played rather sensibly with a4, and rather than trying to keep this knight stable with something like a5, Mieses abandoned ship, played bishop to g4, and after a5, knight d7, bishop captures on c4. Lasker had a borderline winning position, though the game would ultimately be drawn. Now it seems that in between then and now, Mieses did a little bit of reading, and he this time played the best move of e6. In game number 3, I talked a little bit about knight to c3, but Lasker goes for the other move that was played here, e4. Mieses here takes on d5, and while e captures on d5 is far and away the most common move, Lasker I think decides to play Mieses a little bit here by trying to get a queen trade going with queen captures d5. And indeed, there is nothing better. Mieses allows the queen trade, queen captures d5, e captures d5. Now, I found a nice game in the database where black started with knight to e7, where after bishop captures c4, it continued going knight f5, and after castles, knight to d6. This was played in the game between Raymond Kaufman and Darcy Lima from 2008, with black ultimately winning this game. Mieses instead decided to dissuade Lasker from taking on c4 by playing the move a6. This move is a novelty, and so it's as of move 7 that the players are playing a unique game. Now if Lasker takes on c4, Mieses is of course planning to push b5 to get some queenside space, so Lasker stops this by playing a4, and Mieses simply continues developing with knight to d7. Now, Lasker can take on c4 pretty much whenever he wants from this point forward. He decides to delay it for a little bit, starting with the move knight to c3. The point behind delaying it is that Mieses wants to develop this bishop to d6, if possible. The problem here is that if this bishop ever touches the d6 square, Lasker isn't going to take this pawn with the bishop, but he's instead going to move to d2 and take it with the knight. This will come with tempo on the bishop and cause black's position to go into a little bit of disarray. This would be really awkward for black. So Mieses delays the development of his bishop. He first puts his g-knight on f6, and Lasker takes away the d6 square entirely by playing the move bishop to f4. So Mieses pretty much has nothing better than to just put his bishop here on e7, and now that the bishop has been forced to this square, this is a really good time to play bishop captures on c4. Lasker didn't, and we'll talk about this in a second, but it's worth noting that the German chess magazine makes a really good observation that after castles, White gets access to this move d6, and after the bishop goes back to d8, believe it or not, both castling directions are perfectly fine. So White has a whole bunch of freedom and overall has a much more pleasant position. But Lasker continues delaying. He instead defends his pawn through rook to d1. And after Mieses castled, he even doubled down on this and played bishop not to c4, but to e2. Now, of course, this move received a whole bunch of criticism, but actually a little bit of praise by the contemporary analysts, interestingly. Objectively speaking, it's worse than taking on c4, but anyone who supported this move is a bigger fan of this knight going to d2 and taking on c4 instead. So at least in some ways, it's internally consistent. Now, Mieses actually justifies Lasker's decision here by playing knight to h5. This kicks the bishop down to e3, and now that it's no longer defending the d6 square, Mieses puts his bishop there. Now, this was what Lasker was going for. He wanted the bishop to get to d6 so that his knight could take on c4 with tempo. So after g3, limiting the option of both of these pieces, rook to e8, the knight indeed went down to d2. And after knight h to f6, Lasker finally took back on c4. It's been 14 moves, but Lasker finally regained the gambit pawn. Now, how much compensation did he get for the material? His development is certainly better, as Mieses is kind of lacking a good way to develop his light-squared bishop. Lasker's d-pawn, though isolated, is passed, and as we've seen, it can be a very dangerous weapon, especially if it's able to get to d6. The most immediate issue that Mieses is facing is that this bishop is under attack, and the number of good squares for it is quite low. Again, if any retreat square, then the pawn is safe to go to d6, and Mieses is getting crushed here. So Mieses here plays a relatively clever move in bishop to e5. The point is that Lasker doesn't really get all that much for winning the bishop pair. Yes, you're allowed to take here, knight captures e5, knight captures on e5, but the problem is here that the bishop is opened up. So if you castle, then black starts to get a little bit of initiative by playing, for example, bishop to h3. If you prevent this by playing h3 yourself as white, then the bishop goes to f5 instead. Either way, Mieses gets fully developed, and for the first time in this whole game, he actually has reasonably good play. So instead of that, Lasker plays the overwhelmingly best move, a5, simply clamping down on the queen side and really dissuading this knight from moving because it needs to defend the b6 outpost. Now here, Mieses has to trade, otherwise he's just going to get crushed under this space advantage. So bishop captures on c3, b captures c3, and now he's able to get a little bit of an initiative in. Knight to e4 attacks the pawn, which Lasker defends through rook to c1, and now knight to e5. Now here there is absolutely nothing wrong with Lasker trading here on e5 and then defending this pawn with the now unisolated c4 thrust, and he would certainly be for choice in this endgame, would Lasker. He instead decides to go for another fairly consistent move and takes the b6 outpost. This is why he wanted the knight to move away, and after rook to b8, again there's nothing wrong with continuing to play this middle game and going for something like castles, but here Lasker decides to trade into the endgame. Knight captures on c8, rook b captures on c8, and now c4. Now, Lasker is certainly for choice in this endgame as well, don't get me wrong, and I can imagine that getting rid of the bishops is another play to go against Mieses rather than the position. He wants to get rid of the bishops so that Mieses doesn't have any sort of attacking potential, and Lasker will have a very good chance of converting this endgame. So Mieses begins this by coming up with a reasonably strong plan. After f5 and Lasker castles, knight to g4. Now, the problem is that this bishop doesn't really have any good squares to go to. If it goes to f4, then Mieses is going to push g5, and it's going to continue getting harassed. So the path of least resistance for Lasker here is to simply get rid of his bishop pair. So bishop captures g4, f captures g4. Lasker played rook to c2, and after knight to d6, some commentators thought that Mieses had equalized here, and it's easy to understand because he actually develops quite a solid initiative. After king to g2 from Lasker, this rook went down to e4, once again attacking the pawn. Rook f to c1 defends, and now knight to f5. Now, the problem here is that if you're Lasker, you need to find a good way to deal with the fact that there is a lot of pressure that's about to be placed on your center. It turns out that rook to c3 is enough to kill black's initiative entirely. The point here is that black doesn't actually want to take on e3, because after f captures on e3, you've given white another passed pawn, and you're never going to win it. Rook to e8 doesn't do anything because king to f2, this king will hide on e2, and it's white who's actually going to be able to take advantage of all the weaknesses. There's this b pawn on this open b file that's waiting to be harassed. There's now this open f file that white's going to take advantage of. Black is going to have a miserable time defending this endgame. If you continue going on some sort of kingside attack with, let's say you start with h5, then again, white should be able to escape with this king. It'll go to f1, at some point it'll go to e2, and the white king is just not in danger. Black doesn't really have much of an attack here, and again, they're going to have a hard time defending this endgame. It's clear that Lasker did not evaluate rook to c3 as being worth much, because he played the move rook to b2 instead. Now this changes up the status quo, but really not in a good way for him. Now it's also worth noting that none of the analysts really understood rook to c3 either, because here they believe the best move to be knight back to d6, and the point is that this would very likely cause a repetition with rook back to c2 and knight back to f5. And again, if you don't believe that rook to c3 does anything, then this is a completely logical evaluation. You think that you're getting a repetition and a draw. Nothing wrong with that. If you do see that rook to c3 is a good move, then of course you understand that knight back to d6 doesn't really do anything. Mieses thankfully did not play that, and he instead played the best move in the position, which is now to take on e3. The difference here is that after f captures on e3, you're immediately allowed to take here. Rook captures e3, rook captures on b7. Material is still completely equal, but here the black rook has infiltrated the white position, and this is crucial. Rook to e2 with check. Lasker put his king back down on g1, and now if Mieses wanted to go for a draw, he could simply play rook to d2 and he would be well on his way to getting a drawn rook endgame. But seeing that he's already almost equalized, here he decides to play for a little bit more and goes for rook to a2. If he's able to get rid of this a-pawn, then suddenly he has a passed a-pawn and can start playing for the win. Why not? Lasker started creating winning threats of his own, however. He played rook to f1. If this rook gets to f7, then black is in a whole lot of trouble. So Mieses has to deal with this. The best way to do so is to play rook to e8. The point being that if this rook leaves the first rank, then we're going to play rook to e1 with check, force the rook to retreat, and we're going to trade rooks with a drawn endgame. If white instead tries to push their pawn with d6, then black is still in time to play rook back to d2. Now here white has access to rook to e7, so it's a little bit more complicated, but after rook to d8, once the d pawn falls, the draw shouldn't be far away. However, white is able to play rook to f7 here. Now black has to be very careful. They have to give this check on d1. If the king moves up to g2, then we're going to get a repetition. If the king moves up to f2, then we can now neutralize the threats by playing rook to f8 as black. This rook is pinned, so it has to trade, and we get a drawn rook endgame. Mieses kind of jumped the gun a little bit here, and instead of playing rook to e8, he immediately played rook to f8. Now here Lasker could force matters by playing rook captures on f8. He instead decides to start with rook to c7. Now again, if Mieses plays rook to e8, he has some reasonable chances of a draw, but that is a very inconsistent move. Mieses put this rook here on f8 to challenge the rook on f1, and so he traded on f1. Rook captures f1, king captures f1, and rook captures on a5 from Mieses. So this is what he wanted. He has gobbled up Lasker's a-pawn. He now has a passed a-pawn of his own, and to Mieses, he believes that he has winning chances here. Unfortunately, Lasker has a passed pawn of his own, and it is leagues faster. d6. Mieses tries to defend this with king to f8, but after rook to c8 with check, king to f7 is forced, and now d7. With the queening square being protected, Mieses can't do anything to prevent the queen from being made, so all he can do is give checks. Rook to a1 with check, king to e2, rook to a2 check, and after king to e3, it was here on move 39 that Jacques Mieses resigned the game. The problem Mieses faces here, of course, is that after rook to a3 and king to e4, there are no more good checks. So he has to go back down to, let's say, a1, where now Lasker can create a queen. There are a couple more checks that Mieses can give: rook to e1 check, king to f4, rook to f1 check, king captures g4, and h5 with check. If you play king captures h5, then you have to deal with rook f5 check, and the checks aren't over yet. But the most surgically precise move for white here is to play king to g5. Not only does this prevent any further rook checks, but it also takes away some squares from the black king, meaning that black gets checkmated just a little bit faster. So with that, Lasker has won his 4th game of the match. The next game may very well be our last game, because if Lasker wins that game as well, he's won his 5 games, and therefore he wins the match. So we may very well be looking at the end of our little match with Jacques Mieses. You'll have to see the next video to make sure. I look forward to seeing you there. So until then.